I am Benjamin Dixon, and I am excited to be joined by none other than Professor Anthea Butler. She's Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a historian of African American and American religion. Professor, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
No, the pleasure is honestly mine. Like I was saying offline, like I have followed your work for many, many years. My background, I came out of the Black church, the liberation gospel. My first book was about church work. And so obviously that church and politics. So obviously that brought me into your orbit, into your work. Could you just give us a brief snapshot for people who may not know what you do? Tell us about what you do and why it's so important.
Well, what I do and what I teach is I teach about the African American religion, about the Black church specifically. I'm about to teach class this fall on religion from civil rights to Black Lives Matter. The person I trained with actually is a King scholar, so people don't know that a lot about me. But I'm also a historian. I work mostly on 19th and 20th century American religion and African American religious history. But I also have an interest too in African religion. So that's been an important part for me. And a couple of years ago, I went to Nigeria to study prosperity gospel. So that's a whole nother ball game.
We could talk about the differences in the prosperity gospel and liberation theology, particularly as it pertains to politics, right? This isn't just a conversation about differences in theological, or rather theological differences. This really has implications in terms of politics and how we view politics and the role of government and how the government are working and serving the least of these. Can you help the audience understand why that distinction, liberation versus prosperity, really matters, especially in 2020?
It matters a lot because liberation gospel talks about, feeding the poor, having equal rights, being just, thinking about the things that Jesus actually did instead of making up things that Jesus did, feeding the 5,000, all of that kind of stuff. And also it come out of the Catholic tradition, a preferential option for the poor. That means, in other words, when we start to talk about who should get money, who should be fed, who should be taken care of, we wanna make sure that people have food. We wanna make sure that they have medical care. We want to take care of the whole person. It's not just about abortion, right? Because this is the kind of thing you hear about. So this liberation gospel is about giving things to people and not to be ashamed of being poor. The prosperity gospel, on the other hand, says, God wants you to be rich. And if you aren't rich, you aren't blessed. And therefore, they don't care about the poor. If you're poor, you go to a prosperity gospel church, they're gonna say that God did not bless you. They're going to look at you askew and tell you that there's something wrong in your life and you must have sin. And the more prosperous you are, or as I like to say, the more you thieving from people who don't have money, that means that you are blessed. And God must be high, you must be blessed and highly favored, as people like to say all the time, which I hate that phrase, by the way.
It's fun. I often say I'm blessed and highly favored, but I usually say it tongue in cheek.
I know
for that exact reason. So these distinctions really matter, and with the population of Christians in this country, the whether or not God exists or or any of those questions kind of become immaterial when we talk about electoral politics, especially when we talk about evangelicals, Donald Trump, the power of the evangelical movement, the rise of the evangelical movement of Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, and the impact that they have had. Could you draw a line very quickly to help people understand how it is that there's just two totally different vantage points between how someone like you or myself views the role of Christianity or faith in politics and evangelicals, and how they can lead themselves to vote for somebody like Donald Trump?
Well, basically, I could sum it up in one word: racism. Racism is the key. And this is the thing that nobody wants to talk about with evangelicals, because they just all go, why are they like Donald Trump so much? It's about race. Whether we're talking about the 1950s and the Billy Graham, the 1970s with Jerry Falwell. I mean, most people forget that Jerry Falwell was for apartheid. He didn't want to do anything about South Africa in the 80s. Whether we're talking about, George Bush and compassionate conservatism and handing out money to Black churches, but not expecting to do anything for them besides hand out money to preachers, to when we get to Donald Trump, who has surrounded himself with, I call them prosperity pimps or prosperity preachers, who are basically the D-list, not the A-list of evangelicals, right? So he surrounded himself with all those. And basically what they're doing is, serving as a prop, but also serving to get their needs met in the midst of getting Trump's needs met.
And so the impact really resonates, right? I often think about how our fight as African Americans, particularly, really intersects on this religious issue, because oftentimes I think of it in terms of they would lynch us on Saturday night and then be in Sunday school on Sunday morning. And so that history kind of weighs on us. But could you speak in terms of just as a Black woman, in terms of this political structure that is rooted in white Christian men who don't see the faith the same way that you see it?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up lynching on Saturday night, because actually, Ben, they lynched on Sunday mornings too. And my forthcoming book, which is called White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, I talk about this one particular scene where it's from a Methodist Episcopal Church in Oxford, Mississippi, where a man is accused of raping a white woman. It's on a Sunday. They put him in the middle of the town square. And when they decide that they should lynch him, they say, oh, it's Sunday. We shouldn't do this in the town square. We should lynch him behind the church. And so they take him behind the church and lynch him. So this marriage begins very early. And so when we start to talk about this, you have to bring up that history through the 1950s, where you see the marriage of Billy Graham with Eisenhower and then with other people. And then you see how this whole thing has buried itself with it. And they just turned to republicanism in the 70s. And that's where the big shift begins, where we have evangelicals marrying themselves to the Republican Party and forgetting about their Bibles.
As a person of faith, I know you view, or rather you see what's happening politically, and from your writings and your teachings, I can see that it's almost a thorn in your side, how Christianity is portrayed throughout this country. I really want to ask though, in terms of like a pluralistic society, in terms of people who aren't people of faith, people who are agnostic or are atheists, how does your vantage point, particularly like liberation theology, how does it create a society or contribute to a society that is more pluralistic and not so much insisting on creating a government or a theocracy?
Yeah, exactly. I think when we talk about liberation theology, there are needs for the whole person. We don't think about just what we should do for a group of people to try to get judges or something. What you're thinking about doing, if you're a Christian like I am, a liberal Christian, you're basically saying, here are the things that we can meet on. I just had a whole big thing a couple of weeks ago with Black atheists out of Atlanta. And that was a really great talk, because I'm not afraid of atheists or agnostics. As a matter of fact, I like them because they usually tend to talk about religion more intelligently than the people who are religious, right? So, but what I see is that these humanistic ideas that people who are agnostic or atheists think about doing are also the same kinds of ideals and things that we can think about if we are thinking and embracing liberation theology. We are talking about, the poor, we're talking about getting healthcare, we're talking about education, we're talking about things that everybody needs to live in a society. And we're not trying to close off the doors to anyone in that society. Everyone should be free to worship the way that they want, if we take what the founders said when they wrote the Constitution. Now, unfortunately, we're not there today. This is turning into a Christian theocracy, and that is a huge problem.
Yeah. How do you feel? Some of my biggest supporters are atheists, right? I know that sounds like some of my best friends are Black, but it's true. Some of my biggest supporters have been with me for the longest, and they're atheists. And I even have some people from the Church of Satan who actually support my show on a regular basis. How do you feel as a person in this space? Your allies are oftentimes not Christian at all. But then there is like this feeling that I have, like when something happens and a Christian is at the center of it. The doctor who just came out and said that hydroxychloroquine was the cure. I forgot her name, the Black doctor. But how do you feel about being a Christian in this space when we have such poor representation of Christianity on all around us?
Well, first of all, I don't feel like that woman who is talking about demon sperm and everything else represents me. So I know you don't want to go there, but I'm going to go there today because clearly there's not enough time for us to get any demon sperm while there's coronavirus. But here, let me say this real quick. I look at that as an opportunity to be able to dispute these kinds of forms of Christianity and be able to say, this is wrong. I know you believe the way that you do, and there's a whole history about why she's saying what she's saying. But the fact of the matter is, you are a poor representative of Jesus Christ if you claim to represent him. That's kind of my take on it. So I don't feel bad about it. What I feel is that this is a time for me to be able to educate people about where that's wrong, where her thinking is invalid. And I don't even have to do that on theological grounds. I could just do it on mental grounds.
That's why I've been following your work for so long. You got to slide in those points that are cut right to the core of the matter. We only have a few more moments here, but speak to the future, right? You mentioned like the humanist view of a lot of atheists and agnostics, but speak in terms of like a future not grounded in faith so much, but informed by your faith.
I think that future informed by faith is one that we start to care for each other. If coronavirus is not teaching us anything right now, it's two things. One is that you have to take care of your neighbor, as you take care of yourself, and that's to wear a mask, right? But the second part I think is actually even more important is that we are just crossing huge thresholds in terms of death in the last 6 months. And so I think this whole issue of faith is really going to change because people have not been able to grieve the way they need to grieve. They've not been able to do what they need to do. And I think that this is going to really either bring people closer to some kind of faith, no matter what they believe, or they're going to turn away from it. And we'll have to deal with some different kind of forms of that, especially in the Black church where people are so used to gathering together and they are unable to because of this virus, because it's killing us.
Yes. Professor Anthea Butler is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.